Welcome back! This is video 2 in a 3-part series about how to make this spooky vintage dress using Vogue 9076. All of our fabrics are cut, our interfacing is fused, and we're ready to sew. But first, a reminder that you can try the garment on anytime you want as you're sewing. I pin along the seams and try it on constantly. It's much easier to fix anything that you don't like now than wait until it's finished. I'm going to pretty much completely deviate from the pattern when it comes to sewing procedure because I want a clean finish inside. If you're going through the trouble of making your own clothes, they might as well be really nicely made. First, I'm sewing the shoulder seams of my shell fabric and lining fabric from the neck to the edge of the shoulder, which is the opposite way the pattern indicates. You want to try to sew in the direction of the grain as much as possible to reduce the amount that the fabric will stretch. On the lining, I press the seam open, then trim the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch and trim the edges down to about 1/16 of an inch away from the stitching. This way there's less bulk when it gets folded back. On the shell fabric, I'm pressing the seams open and only trimming away that last 1/2 inch or so at the edges. I'm leaving just enough fabric to keep the stitching from falling out. Now I want to gather the front and back bodice pieces between the notches, so I lengthened my stitch to about 4 mm and sewed at 3/8 inch, so I was still inside of the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Pull the bobbin threads to gather the fabric until it's about the same size as the yoke. Then pin it in place and even out the gathers. Pin those in place too and sew at 1/2 inch. I like to sew with the gathers on top so I can continue evening them out. Don't forget to change your stitch length back to the setting you like. I'm usually around 2.5 mm for most fabrics. On the front bodice, pinning gets a little trickier because we also have to plan for the corner. As they say, proper planning prevents piss-poor performance. I'm marking the stitch line at the corners of the front yoke and the corresponding corners of the front bodice pieces. On this side, I'm going to be sewing from the bottom up, so I'm pinning just the straight side up to the corner. On this side, I'm going to be sewing from the outside in and down, so I'm pinning just the part with the gathers up to the point. I leave the rest unpinned for now. At my machine, I'm sewing at 1/2 inch and making sure the gathers are even as I go. As I get within 1/2 inch of the corner, I shorten my stitch length to about 2 mm or less on very fine fabrics. I stop with the needle right through the point, then lift up the bodice fabric and use small scissors to snip into the corner of the yoke piece. Now I can fold the yoke back and pivot to open up that corner and continue sewing the bodice down. After 1/2 inch or so, I switch back to my normal stitch length and finish the seam. On the other side, it's a similar approach, just reversed. I'm sewing the long straight line first, stopping right at the point, snipping the corner, pivoting and finishing the seam. Press the seam allowance of the gathers to flatten them out a little bit, then remove the gathering stitch. You should be able to pull it right out. I'm going to run those edges through my serger to get them even flatter. Press the seams toward the yoke pieces. Pin the bodice side seams together. Sew them at 1/2 inch and press them open. Now let's put together the waistband pieces. Just sew the side seams of the shell and lining, then press them open. Before I sew the waistband on, I want to check the length. I pinned the waistband onto the original length of the bodice and tried it on. I was pleasantly surprised that the fit was perfect. So I removed the pins and cut off the extension I had added onto my pattern. Then I marked the garment and removed the extra 1.5 inches there too. I'm trimming away the seam allowances from where the next seams will be. I need to gather the bottoms of the bodice, so I'm increasing my stitch length to 4 mm and sewing between the notches on the front and back pieces at about 3/8 inch. Then pull the bobbin threads together and pin it to the waistband. Sew at 1/2 inch. Then press the seam allowance to flatten the gathers and remove the gathering stitch. I want this yoke and waistband seam to be open so the seam is less obvious, so I need to snip into the seam allowance of the yoke. This way, this section can press open and this section can still press down. Then run it through a serger or just stitch near the edge to keep the gathered seam allowances flat. Grab the left extension piece that has fusing on one side. Fold it in half and sew it 1/2 inch on the top and the bottom. Then trim the seam allowances like this, so it doesn't bunch up at the point and isn't so bulky at the seam edge. Flip it right side out and use a point turner to push the points out. Then press it in half. Pin it to the front of the bodice at the upper notch and sew it 1/2 inch. It should end 1/2 inch above the edge of the bodice. This way it will be out of the way when we put in the skirt later. Now the loops on the other side. I got this little elastic cord at a local craft store, and it'll be great to go around the little buttons I have for this dress. I tested how big I want them and decided on only 2 inches, so there's not too much room for the button to pop out while I'm wearing it. I used a lighter to melt the ends and marked the loop placement on the dress. This little bitty elastic is going to be hard to sew through, so I'm using little pieces of fusible interfacing to attach them to the garment. I press the iron on both sides of the elastic to really snug it into place. This will hold them exactly where they need to be until I can sew them down. I shortened my stitch length to about 1.2 millimeters and stitched just shy of the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and again in the middle of the seam allowance. These loops aren't going anywhere. That's as far as I want to go on the bodice right now. Let's move on to the sleeves. I'll start with the easing stitch at the sleeve cap. I'm going to sew just between these notches using a 4 millimeter stitch length and sewing at 3/8 inch just inside the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I don't like the way the cuff opening is at the sleeve inseam. That will put the opening at the inside of your wrist. I'd rather have it at the back of my hand, so I'm going to make a little bound opening right here, more in line with the back of my shoulder blade. I transferred the marks to the right and wrong side of my sleeve pieces. On the front I drew the line. On the back I cut a narrow strip of interfacing, about 5/8 inches wide, and I'm fusing it centered over where the slit is going to be. Now I want to sew with a short stitch length about 2 millimeters and a narrow V around the future opening. See how the V is slightly rounded at the tip. Now I need to cut that open. I'm cutting most of the way with a rotary cutter, then I use small scissors to get right up into that point of the stitches without cutting through them. To bind the opening, I'm going to use this Old Faithful Snug Hug. Now it's just called seam binding, which is not nearly as fun, but I guess it's a little more self-explanatory. I cut pieces a few inches longer than I'll need and press them in half. Then nestle the sleeve opening right into the fold and slowly sew it in place. The corner is a little tricky. You have to kind of ease the sleeve around the corner, keeping enough of it in the binding to catch under the needle. You might want to practice on some scraps first. Press the new opening and then go in and sew across the fold of the seam binding so it stays where you want it. Now I can sew the entire length of the sleeve inseam. Press that open. I want to sew the gathering stitch at the bottom edge of the sleeve, so I increased my stitch length and I'm sewing at 3/8 inch from the edge. Now to the cuffs. I'm trimming them down 3/4 inch so they're a little more fitted and the crossover isn't as large. I'm also going to use snaps instead of buttons and loops. Mark out a 1/2 inch on the lining side of the cuff, which will be the part that's folded up. For me, it's the part that I didn't put interfacing on. Press that and then trim it down to 3/8 inch. Mark a 1/2 inch at the top of the outer fabric and fold the cuff in half up to that mark. Be sure to add loops if you're doing loop and button closure. Then sew the ends at a 1/2 inch. Trim away the corner and grade the seam allowances or stagger them. Use a point presser to press the edges open and then toward the lining. Then press the cuffs flat with the edges rolled slightly toward the inside of the cuff. Turn the sleeves right side out and pin the front of the opening to the side of the cuff with no extension. Pin the back of the opening at the notch on the other side of the cuff. Then pull your gathering stitch thread and pin the sleeve onto the cuff, evening out the gathers as you go. Be sure not to pin through the lining side of the cuff. Adjust the pins and gathers until you're happy, then sew it at a 1/2 inch. Press the seam allowance flat and run it through a serger or stitch near the edge to control the gathers. Then fold the seam allowance into the cuff, pin, and hand sew closed. You could also use your sewing machine to stitch close to the edge. Then give it one more good press. I'm using little black enamel snaps for the cuff closure. I have a kick press from Gold Star Tool, so I'm going to use this to apply my snaps. There. Now the sleeves can go into the bodice. With the bodice inside out, pin the sleeve into the arm's eye, matching the notches. Then pull the gathering threads from earlier and gather the fullness of the sleeve cap. It should only be gathered within the yoke area. Even out the gathers and pin them in place, then sew at a 1/2 inch. Be sure to keep the yoke seam allowances folded up as you sew on the sleeve. Press the gathers in the seam allowance, remove the gathering stitch, and then serge the edge. This is a good place to stop for today. Next week we'll put together the skirt and do all of the finishing.